She pressured the cowboy every night, until the worn-out rancher finally took drastic action. Jack Cooper had lived on the Cooper Ranch for more than 30 years. The ranch stretched across hundreds of acres of rolling hills dotted with wide-open pastures, grazing cattle, and the occasional cluster of oak trees that offered shade in the blazing sun. Jack had inherited the ranch from his father, who had worked the land with the same hands and the same quiet determination. From the time Jack was a boy, he had learned the rhythms of the land, how to check the fences before the cattle roamed too far, how to feed the animals, and how to mend broken gates with patience and skill. The work was hard, tiring, and sometimes lonely, but Jack loved it. He loved the smell of hay in the morning, the soft lowing of cows in the evening, and the way the land seemed to stretch endlessly under the sky. Jack's days began before sunrise. He would wake to the sound of birds outside his window, pull on his worn boots, and head out to check the animals. There was always something that needed doing on the ranch: repairs to the fence, feeding, moving the herd, and making sure the water troughs were clean. His hands were rough and calloused from decades of work, and his back ached from years of lifting, bending, and walking long distances over uneven land. Even so, Jack never complained. He felt a sense of pride in his work, knowing that each day he was caring for something that had been in his family for generations. The evenings, however, were Jack's favorite part of the day. After a long day of work, he could sit on the porch, sip a cup of coffee, and watch the sun sink behind the hills. The air cooled, the cattle returned to their pens, and a calm silence spread across the ranch. These were the moments when Jack could breathe, think, and enjoy the quiet that had always been part of his life. For him, the evenings were a time to rest, to enjoy a good meal, and sometimes to read or write letters to old friends. The peaceful rhythm of the ranch life was simple, but it suited him perfectly. Everything changed the day Linda arrived. She was new to the town, having recently moved from a nearby city to escape the rush and stress of urban life. Linda was lively, talkative, and full of energy, everything that Jack was not. She had heard about the Cooper Ranch and often came by to see the land and the man who had kept it running for so many years. At first, Jack welcomed her politely, offering her water and a place to sit in the shade. She asked questions about the cattle, the land, and the daily routines of ranch life. Jack answered her carefully, happy to share a little about the work he loved. It was the evenings, though, when Linda's presence began to feel like more than just friendly visits. She would appear just as Jack was finishing his chores and trying to relax. She wanted to talk, to share stories, and sometimes to ask for his help with small tasks around the ranch. At first, Jack thought it was harmless. He enjoyed conversation, and he didn't want to be rude. But as the days passed, her visits grew longer. She began expecting Jack to spend his evenings with her, interrupting the quiet time he treasured. Jack found himself staying later than he wanted, smiling politely, while his body ached for rest. The strain started to show. Jack's work began to take longer than usual because he was tired. He missed small tasks that were usually routine, like tightening a fence or checking the water tanks. Some mornings, he felt heavier and slower than before, his body complaining from the lack of proper rest. Jack did not like to complain to anyone, so he kept these feelings to himself. He told himself that it was only temporary, and that Linda would soon settle into a routine that did not interfere with his life. But deep down, he knew that the constant pressure was beginning to affect him. Jack tried to handle the situation quietly at first. He offered polite excuses, explaining that he had chores to finish or needed to rest before sunrise. He suggested that Linda visit during the daytime, when the ranch work could keep them both busy. At times, she seemed to understand and would leave early, but other times she would smile and insist that the evening was the perfect time for a visit. Jack could see no way to refuse her without causing offense, and he valued peace in the ranch and in his interactions with people. So he continued to endure, hoping that patience would be enough. Despite his efforts, Jack began to notice changes in his routine that troubled him. The evenings he once used to enjoy were no longer peaceful. He could not read or relax in the way he liked, and even his meals were eaten hurriedly while talking. The quiet moments, which had always given him energy for the next day, were disappearing. He started to feel drained, not just physically but mentally. The energy he once had to face long hours of work seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of tension and worry. Jack also began to worry about the effect on the ranch itself. A ranch required constant attention, and every moment spent in distraction could have consequences. A missed check on the cattle could mean an animal in trouble. A neglected fence could allow a cow to wander into the neighbor's land. These were risks Jack had always managed carefully, but now, with his attention divided, he found himself wondering if he could keep everything under control. It was a strange feeling for someone who had spent decades knowing exactly what to do and when. Despite the stress, Jack felt a sense of loyalty and kindness toward Linda. She was new in town, and he understood that moving to a rural area from a city could be lonely. He told himself that a few extra hours in the evening were a small price to pay for friendship. But as time passed, he began to see that the visits were not just friendly. They were persistent, nightly, and demanding. Jack realized that kindness alone could not solve this problem. He needed a way to protect his own time and energy without hurting someone else. During this period, Jack found moments to reflect quietly. Sitting on the porch after the sun had set, he watched the stars emerge, thinking about how life had changed. The ranch had always been a place of control, of order, and of peace. Now, that peace felt fragile, threatened by circumstances he had not faced before. He realized that this challenge was not about being unkind or rude. It was about protecting a way of life he had built with his own hands. Jack understood that learning to say no was just as important as the work he did with the cattle, the land, and the fences. Even as he considered these things, Jack remained gentle and patient. He continued to answer Linda's questions about the ranch, explaining the animals, the land, and the chores in simple terms. He guided her when she offered to help, showing her how to feed the animals properly or fix a gate. Deep down, he hoped that by sharing his knowledge, Linda would understand the demands of ranch life and adjust her expectations. But each evening, as the light faded over the pastures and Linda's visits continued, Jack could feel the pressure mounting. He was caught between his natural desire to help and his need for rest. The situation continued for weeks. Jack's body grew tired, but his mind remained alert, constantly calculating how to manage his responsibilities while also keeping peace. He began to notice that his moods were affected. Small frustrations that he would normally ignore started to linger. He found himself snapping at minor inconveniences, though never at Linda directly. He felt guilty for these feelings, but could not deny the reality. The constant evening visits were wearing him down. Through all of this, the ranch itself remained a place of beauty and life. The cattle roamed peacefully. The fields were green in the spring, and the sunsets painted the sky in gold and pink. Jack loved every part of it, and he did not want to lose this peace. He knew that in order to preserve the ranch's quiet and the work he loved, he would eventually have to make a decision about how to handle the nightly pressure. But for now, he continued to endure, hoping that a solution would appear before he reached his breaking point. Jack's story in these first weeks of tension is one of patience, endurance, and quiet reflection. He is a man tied to his work and his land, navigating the challenge of balancing kindness with self-care. The ranch, once a place of calm and routine, has become a stage for a different kind of struggle, one that tests his limits, his patience, and his understanding of what it means to protect one's own peace. And as the days pass, Jack knows that eventually something will have to change. The evenings that were once his sanctuary have become a challenge he cannot ignore, and he senses that the moment to act is drawing closer with every sunset. The pressure from Linda did not ease as the weeks passed. If anything, it grew heavier. Jack Cooper had hoped that after a few polite hints, she would understand his need for rest after long days on the ranch. But Linda seemed to miss the subtle signs, or perhaps she chose to ignore them. Every evening, just as Jack was finishing up the last chores of the day, she would appear at the edge of the ranch road, smiling and full of energy. Her presence, which at first had been pleasant, now felt like an unrelenting weight pressing down on Jack's already tired shoulders. Jack tried to remain calm and polite, as he always had been. He would smile and greet her, hiding the fatigue behind a courteous nod. "Evening, Linda," he would say, his voice gentle but wary. "What brings you by tonight?" She would reply with a cheerful laugh, explaining that she wanted to see the sunset, talk about the ranch, or sometimes ask for his help with something small. Each time Jack agreed, hoping that even a short conversation would satisfy her and allow him to return to his much-needed rest. But short conversations rarely lasted. Linda had a way of talking that made it easy for her to continue, moving from one topic to the next without pause. She shared stories of her city life, her family, and the changes she was trying to make in her new rural environment. She asked questions about the cattle, about the crops, and about Jack's daily routines. She seemed genuinely interested, and in another time Jack would have enjoyed sharing his knowledge. But now his patience was thinning. The long days, the constant physical work, and the pressure to entertain someone every evening were wearing him down. Jack noticed changes in himself. Small habits began to shift. He would sometimes delay certain chores just to finish speaking with Linda, though he knew this would make the work harder the next day. He found that he was less patient with the animals, and even with the ranch itself. A fence that might have been repaired quickly and carefully before now took longer because his mind was elsewhere. Even feeding the cattle felt like a chore he had to force himself through, rather than a simple familiar routine. These changes worried him. Jack had always prided himself on being reliable and careful, and the idea that his attention was slipping made him uneasy. One evening after a particularly long day, Jack returned from checking the far pasture to find Linda waiting near the barn. The sun had already begun to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the ground. Jack's back ached and his hands were sore from the hours of lifting and repairing fences. Normally, he would have welcomed the sight of a friendly face, but that evening the sight of Linda filled him with a sense of dread. He knew she would want to talk, and he knew that he would have to find a way to navigate the conversation without losing his temper. "Evening, Jack," Linda called, waving energetically. "I thought I'd see the sunset with you tonight. You always say it's the most beautiful from the porch." Her voice was warm and enthusiastic, full of life, and yet Jack felt a pang of exhaustion just looking at her. He wanted to explain that he was tired, that he had been working since before sunrise, and that he needed a quiet evening. But the words would not come easily. He did not want to hurt her feelings. So he smiled instead. "Sure, Linda. Let's head to the porch," he said, trying to mask the fatigue in his tone. As they walked, he carried a small chair for her and settled onto his own seat, hoping that the conversation would be brief. But Linda was not one to be brief. She launched into stories of her day, talking quickly and laughing often. She asked questions about the ranch, about the animals, and about Jack's past experiences. Jack answered, trying to keep up, but his mind wandered to the chores he had left unfinished and the long day that still stretched ahead tomorrow. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated itself. Every evening, Linda would arrive with her questions and stories, her energy undiminished by the setting sun. Jack tried subtle hints, like yawning or mentioning that he needed to check on the cattle, but Linda seemed oblivious. He considered being firmer, telling her that he needed quiet evenings, but he hesitated. Jack had always been a gentle man, reluctant to hurt anyone's feelings. He worried that if he were too direct, Linda might take offense or feel unwelcome. The community began to notice a change in Jack, too. Neighbors would pass by the ranch in the evening and see him looking tired and distracted, speaking to Linda while the animals waited in the distance. Friends who stopped by to check on him would ask if he was feeling all right, noticing the strain in his posture and the dark circles under his eyes. Jack smiled and assured them he was fine, but inside he knew that he was reaching a limit. The pressure was becoming more than just a personal inconvenience. It was affecting his health, his work, and the life he had carefully built on the ranch. Jack began to reflect deeply on the situation. He thought about his father, who had taught him the value of hard work, patience, and quiet strength. He thought about the ranch, the land that had been in his family for generations, and the routines that kept it running smoothly. Jack realized that he could not continue on this path indefinitely. He needed to find a way to protect his own time and energy, not out of unkindness, but out of necessity. If he did not, he risked losing the calm and control that made his life on the ranch possible. One evening, After a particularly long day, Jack decided to test a different approach. When Linda arrived, he greeted her politely but immediately mentioned that he was tired and had chores to finish before it grew too dark. He hoped that by being honest, she would understand his needs. "Linda," he said, "I've had a long day. I really need some quiet time this evening to finish my work." He expected her to understand at least partially, but Linda's response was not what he hoped. She looked surprised, then slightly disappointed. "Oh, I didn't realize you were so busy," she said softly. "I just thought we could watch the sunset together. It's such a beautiful view, and I wanted to share it with you." Her voice was gentle, but Jack could feel the weight of expectation in her words. He realized that subtle hints and polite explanations were not enough. Linda did not fully understand the toll her nightly visits were taking, and he could no longer rely on patience alone to resolve the situation. Over the next few days, Jack observed the effect of this new honesty. Linda still came by in the evenings, though sometimes she seemed hesitant, sensing the change in his tone. Jack found himself feeling more alert, more aware of the need to maintain his routines and boundaries. He tried to be firm while remaining polite, explaining that he needed time to care for the ranch, the animals, and himself. Slowly, he began to reclaim small portions of his evenings for rest, though the challenge was far from over. Despite these efforts, Jack knew that the situation required more than occasional honesty. He needed a plan, a way to manage both his responsibilities and the expectations of someone who did not yet understand his limits. He began to think carefully about how to communicate more clearly, how to enforce boundaries without causing conflict, and how to protect the peace that had always been his sanctuary. Jack reflected on the importance of self-care, realizing that even the strongest, most patient individuals must sometimes stand firm to maintain their well-being. In these weeks, Jack also found small moments of comfort. He would wake early, before anyone else, and watch the sunrise over the pastures. The air was crisp, the birds sang, and the ranch seemed calm and untouched. These moments reminded him of why he worked so hard, why he endured the challenges, and why he needed to protect the evenings that allowed him to recharge. They became his anchor, a reminder that while social expectations and pressures were part of life, they could not replace the peace and stability that came from tending the land and caring for the animals. Jack's story in this period is one of endurance, reflection, and gradual awareness. He learned that patience alone could not solve every problem, that sometimes direct communication and firm boundaries were necessary. He also discovered the importance of balancing kindness with self-respect, understanding that caring for others should never come at the expense of one's own health or responsibilities. The ranch remained a place of beauty and life, a sanctuary that required vigilance, love, and sometimes difficult decisions. By the end of these weeks, Jack had begun to change. He was still polite and considerate, but he had started to set limits to protect the precious time he needed for rest and work. Linda had not fully adjusted to this new approach, but Jack felt a growing sense of confidence. He knew that eventually he would have to take stronger steps to ensure his own well-being. But he was no longer drifting helplessly under the weight of nightly pressure. He was beginning to reclaim control over his life, his work, and the peace of the ranch he loved so deeply. The tension in Jack Cooper's life continued to grow. Even though he had started setting small boundaries with Linda, the nightly visits were still a heavy weight on his shoulders. The ranch was demanding, and Jack was tired from long days of physical work. He woke up before sunrise, tending to the animals, repairing fences, and checking the water supply in the troughs. Every day was full of tasks that required focus, strength, and care. And every evening, just when he thought he could finally rest, Linda appeared, full of energy and ready to talk. At first, Jack tried to manage the situation with kindness. He had always been a patient man, believing that politeness and understanding could solve most problems. He would smile, greet her warmly, and answer her questions, all while wishing he could quietly finish his evening chores or simply sit on the porch in peace. But as the weeks passed, he realized that politeness alone was not enough. Linda did not understand the toll her visits were taking on him, and subtle hints and gentle explanations were not enough to make her adjust. One evening, after a particularly long day, Jack felt the strain more than ever. The summer sun had been hot, and he had spent hours repairing a broken fence that had threatened to let the cattle wander onto the neighbor's property. His hands were blistered, his back ached, and his legs were sore from walking the uneven terrain. He had barely had time to eat a proper lunch, and his energy was nearly gone. He had hoped that tonight he could simply sit on the porch and watch the sunset in silence. But as he approached the house, he saw Linda waiting near the gate, smiling and waving enthusiastically. "Evening, Jack," she called out, her voice bright and cheerful. "I thought we could watch the sunset together again. It's always so beautiful here." Jack forced a smile and greeted her, hiding the exhaustion he felt inside. "Sure, Linda. Let's head to the porch," he said, trying to keep his tone gentle. He carried a chair for her and sat down in his own, hoping the conversation would be brief. But it was not brief. Linda launched into her stories as usual, talking about her day in the city before she moved, her experiences in the new town, and the challenges of adjusting to rural life. She asked questions about the cattle, the crops, and Jack's daily work, and she expected detailed answers. Jack tried to respond patiently, but his mind was tired, his body ached, and his energy was gone. He began to notice that he was less able to focus, and even small tasks seemed to require more effort than usual. The strain started to affect Jack's moods. He found himself becoming frustrated more easily, snapping at minor inconveniences and feeling impatient with things that had never bothered him before. The animals, the fences, and even the routine of feeding the cattle felt heavier than usual. He knew he was changing, and he did not like it. Jack had always been reliable and patient, and the thought that he might lose control over his temper troubled him deeply. During these days, Jack began reflecting more deeply on the situation. He remembered the lessons his father had taught him, that hard work required discipline, patience, and careful planning. He thought about the ranch, the land that had been in his family for generations, and the importance of maintaining balance between work and rest. He realized that his evenings, once a time of peace and quiet, were now filled with stress and fatigue. He knew that if he continued like this, his work on the ranch would suffer, and his own well-being would deteriorate further. Jack decided that he needed to act, but he struggled with how to do so. He was not a man who enjoyed confrontation, and he did not want to hurt Linda's feelings. He thought about trying to explain again, to make her understand the demands of ranch life, hoping that she would respect his need for rest. But deep down, he knew that this would not be enough. Linda seemed oblivious to the exhaustion she was causing, and subtle hints had already failed. Jack realized that he would need to be more firm if he wanted to regain control over his evenings. One night after another long day, Jack reached a breaking point. The cattle had been restless due to a sudden storm, and he had spent hours guiding them back to the safety of the pens. The fences had been damaged, and he had repaired them under pouring rain, his clothes soaked and his hands raw. When he returned to the house, he hoped for a quiet evening, but Linda was already there, waiting at the gate with her usual cheerful smile. "Evening, Jack." "I thought we could sit and watch the stars tonight," she said, her voice full of excitement. Jack felt a wave of frustration rise inside him. He wanted to tell her, firmly and clearly, that he could not spend every evening with her, but he also felt guilty at the thought of hurting her feelings. He sat down on the porch, his back stiff, and took a deep breath. He knew that he had to speak honestly, even if it was uncomfortable. "Linda," he began, his voice steady but firm, "I've had a very long day. I need to finish my chores and rest tonight. I cannot spend every evening with you. I hope you understand." Linda looked surprised, her smile fading slightly. "Oh, I didn't realize it was such a long day for you," she said softly. "I just wanted to spend some time with you. I didn't mean to make things difficult." Jack nodded, appreciating her attempt to understand, but he knew that a single explanation would not be enough. The nightly pressure had been ongoing for weeks, and he needed to create a clear boundary that would last. Over the next few days, Jack began to implement small but firm changes. He politely told Linda when he was too tired for visits and suggested she'd come by during the day if she wanted to see the ranch. He created a schedule for himself, making sure to finish his evening chores first before engaging in conversation. Slowly, he began to reclaim some of his evenings, finding small pockets of quiet to rest and regain his energy. He knew that maintaining them would require consistency and courage. He worried about being seen as rude or unfriendly, but he also understood that his own well-being and the care of the ranch had to come first. Each evening he reminded himself that setting limits was not unkind. It was necessary. Without rest, he would not have the strength to continue the work he loved, and the ranch would suffer as a result. During this time, Jack also reflected on the lessons he was learning about communication and self-respect. He realized that patience and kindness were important, but they could not replace honesty and firmness. He needed to balance his natural gentleness with the ability to enforce boundaries, even if it meant temporary discomfort. This was a new challenge for him, but he approached it with the same careful planning and thoughtfulness he applied to the ranch. Despite the tension, Jack still found moments of beauty and peace. Early in the mornings, before anyone else was awake, he would walk the pastures and watch the sunrise. The air was crisp, the birds sang, and the world seemed quiet and still. These moments reminded him of why he worked so hard and why he loved the ranch. They became his anchor, giving him strength to face the challenges of the evenings and the nightly pressure that had become part of his life. Jack's story during this period is one of growth and awareness. He learned that endurance alone was not enough, that subtle hints and politeness could not always resolve conflict, and that firm boundaries were sometimes necessary. He discovered that caring for oneself was just as important as caring for others, and that protecting one's time and energy was a sign of strength, not weakness. The ranch remained a place of life, beauty, and responsibility, but it also became a classroom for Jack, teaching him about courage, self-respect, and the importance of standing firm when necessary. As the weeks passed, Jack began to feel more confident. He was still polite and considerate with Linda, but he was no longer passive. He had learned to speak up, to explain his needs clearly, and to protect the peace that was essential to his life and work. He knew that challenges might continue and that he might face difficult decisions, but he felt ready to handle them. Jack had reached a point where he understood that standing firm and caring for oneself was not only acceptable, it was essential. The tension in Jack's evenings had not disappeared entirely, but it had shifted. He had begun to take control of his own time, to reclaim the quiet and rest that had always been part of the ranch life he cherished. Linda, for her part, seemed to sense the change. She adjusted her visits, sometimes leaving earlier or coming during the day instead of the evening. Slowly the balance was returning, and Jack felt a growing sense of relief. Through all of this, Jack learned that life on the ranch, while demanding, could also teach important lessons about human relationships, patience, and self-care. He discovered that kindness must sometimes be paired with firmness, and that maintaining one's own well-being is essential for the care of others and the work one loves. The nights were still a challenge, but Jack faced them with a new understanding and a renewed sense of confidence. Jack Cooper had reached the point where patience and small boundaries were no longer enough. The weeks of nightly visits and constant pressure from Linda had worn him down, despite his efforts to manage the situation politely. The ranch demanded his full attention, and he could feel the strain in every muscle, every movement, and every thought. Even after setting limits during the evenings, the stress lingered, leaving him restless and uneasy. Jack realized that he could not continue like this. Something had to change. The summer days were long and the work never ended. Jack spent hours each morning feeding the animals, repairing fences, and checking the water supply. Every task required strength, focus, and attention. Some days he rose before dawn, walking across the dewy pastures while the sun slowly painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. He cherished these quiet mornings, knowing they were his chance to prepare for the challenges ahead. Yet, despite the early mornings, the nights still brought a heavy burden. Linda's visits, filled with energy and expectations, intruded on the precious hours he had for rest. Jack had thought carefully about his options. He was not a man who enjoyed confrontation, but he now knew that gentle hints and polite refusals were insufficient. He needed to set clear, firm boundaries, ones that could not be ignored or misunderstood. For days he rehearsed in his mind what he would say. He wanted to remain kind, honest, and respectful, but he also needed to protect his health, his work, and the balance of his life. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that taking action was not a choice. It was a necessity. That evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Jack finally decided it was time to act. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the pastures. The cattle were returning to their pens and the fences were all secure. Jack had finished his chores but felt drained, both physically and mentally. He knew that Linda would soon arrive, as she did almost every evening, hoping to talk and spend time with him. This time he would be ready. When Linda appeared at the gate, smiling as always, Jack walked toward her calmly, but with a sense of purpose. "Evening, Linda," he said politely. "I'm glad you came, but I need to talk to you about something important." Linda looked curious, tilting her head slightly. "Of course, Jack. What is it?" she asked, her voice gentle. Jack motioned for her to sit on the porch, and he settled into his own chair. The air was warm, and the sound of the evening wind rustling through the trees created a calm background. Jack took a deep breath. "Linda," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I've been patient and tried to manage this politely, but I need to be honest with you. Your nightly visits and pressure to spend every evening together are affecting me more than you realize. I am tired from the work on the ranch, and I need my evenings to rest and take care of the animals and the land. I cannot continue to spend every evening in this way." Linda's smile faded, replaced by a look of surprise. I didn't realize it was so serious," she said softly. "I just thought spending time together would be nice. I didn't mean to make things difficult for you." Jack nodded, appreciating her attempt to understand, but he knew that explaining alone would not be enough. "I know you mean well," he said, "and I value your friendship, but I have to set a firm boundary. Evenings are mine to rest, and I need you to respect that. If you want to visit, we can do so during the day, when I have time and energy to spend with you properly." Linda looked down, thinking. Jack could see that she was trying to process what he had said. He waited patiently, knowing that the conversation might be uncomfortable, but also understanding that it was necessary. "I understand," she said after a moment. "I didn't realize I was causing so much pressure. I'll try to come by during the day instead." Jack nodded again, feeling a mixture of relief and resolve. This was the first step in taking back control of his life and protecting the peace of the ranch. The next few days were challenging. Linda adjusted her schedule, sometimes appearing during the day, sometimes hesitating before visiting at all. Jack maintained his firmness, politely reminding her of the boundaries he had set whenever necessary. It was not easy. He felt guilty at times, worrying that he might hurt her feelings. But he also knew that failing to protect his time would only lead to further exhaustion and stress. Slowly, he began to notice a change. The evenings that had once been tense and filled with pressure were gradually becoming quiet and restful once more. Jack found new energy in his work. With the evenings freed from constant interruptions, he could focus more fully on the ranch tasks. Fences were repaired more efficiently, water supplies were carefully checked, and the animals received his full attention. He felt a renewed sense of pride in his work, knowing that he could care for the land properly, without the distraction of nightly pressure. The ranch itself seemed calmer, more organized, and more vibrant, reflecting the changes in Jack's own life. In addition to the physical relief, Jack experienced emotional growth. He had learned an important lesson about self-respect and personal boundaries. He understood that being kind and patient did not mean sacrificing his own well-being. Protecting his time, energy, and peace was necessary for both himself and the ranch. Jack realized that taking action, even when difficult, was a sign of strength, not weakness. It required courage to speak honestly, enforce boundaries, and maintain consistency. Over time, Jack's confidence grew. He approached Linda politely but firmly, reinforcing the boundaries he had established. He discovered that clear communication, paired with honesty and respect, could resolve tension without conflict. Linda gradually adjusted, visiting less frequently in the evenings and respecting the limits he had set. Jack no longer felt drained by her presence, and the peace of the ranch returned. Jack also noticed changes in himself beyond the ranch work. He slept more soundly, ate more properly, and found time to enjoy simple pleasures like reading a book or sipping coffee on the porch. The quiet evenings allowed him to reflect on his life, appreciate the beauty of the land, and plan for the future. He felt a sense of control that had been missing during the weeks of nightly pressure. This balance restored not only his physical energy but also his emotional well-being. One evening, as Jack sat on the porch watching the sunset, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The ranch had always been a place of work, responsibility, and quiet beauty, but it had also become a place of learning, teaching him about human relationships, patience, and the importance of self-respect. Jack realized that standing firm and taking action, even when uncomfortable, was necessary to preserve both the land he loved and the life he had built. The drastic action Jack had taken, firmly setting boundaries and insisting on respect for his time, had transformed his evenings and his life. The tension that had weighed heavily on him was lifted, replaced by a calm and quiet that allowed him to enjoy the ranch fully. He understood that kindness and patience were important, but they had to be balanced with honesty and firmness. Protecting his time and energy was not selfish. It was essential for maintaining the life he loved and the work he had dedicated himself to for decades. Even Linda, though initially surprised by Jack's firmness, came to respect his boundaries. She adjusted her visits, understanding that the evenings were no longer available for long conversations or socializing. Their interactions became more balanced, less stressful, and more enjoyable. Jack found that he could now share the ranch experience with her without compromising his own needs. The friendship, when managed with respect for boundaries, became healthier and more sustainable. Jack's story during this period is one of courage, growth, and self-respect. He faced a difficult situation, took action to protect his well-being, and learned that firmness and honesty are essential tools for managing both relationships and responsibilities. The ranch remained a place of beauty, life, and work, but it also became a symbol of his ability to stand up for himself, maintain balance, and enforce boundaries. By the end of these weeks, Jack felt a renewed sense of strength. He had taken the drastic action necessary to protect his evenings, his work, and his life. He had learned that setting boundaries was not only acceptable, but vital. He could now face each day with renewed energy, knowing that the peace of the ranch and the quality of his life was secure. The lessons he had learned would remain with him, guiding him in both his work and his relationships. Jack's evenings returned to the quiet, calm, and restorative moments he had always cherished. He watched the sunsets in peace, listened to the soft sounds of the cattle returning to their pens, and enjoyed the beauty of the land he had worked so hard to care for. The drastic action he had taken had not been easy, but it had been necessary. And in taking it, Jack had reclaimed not just his evenings, but his strength, his focus, and the life he loved on the ranch. The days after Jack Cooper set firm boundaries felt different on the ranch. There was a quiet calm that had been missing for weeks, a peace that allowed Jack to breathe deeply for the first time in a long while. The sun rose gently over the pastures, painting the fields in soft shades of gold, and Jack felt a sense of relief as he walked among the grazing cattle. The work on the ranch remained demanding, but without the added pressure of nightly visits. He could focus fully and carry out each task with care and energy. Jack noticed the changes in himself immediately. His body felt less heavy. His back and shoulders no longer ached as constantly, and his mind was clearer. Tasks that had once felt exhausting now flowed more smoothly. He could check the fences, feed the animals, and inspect the water troughs without the mental weight of worrying about what might happen after the sun set. Even the chores that were normally mundane felt satisfying because he could now give them his full attention, rather than working distracted and tired. The evenings, once filled with pressure and tension, were now peaceful. Jack could sit on the porch after his work and enjoy the quiet. He often poured a cup of coffee, settled into his worn wooden chair, and watched the sunset. The colors over the pastures seemed more vivid, the sounds of nature more comforting, and the feeling of calm more profound. The ranch, which had always been a place of life and responsibility, had become a sanctuary once more, a place where Jack could recharge, think, and reflect on his life. Even Linda had adjusted to the new arrangement. At first, she had been hesitant and unsure of how to respect the boundaries Jack had set. She still visited occasionally, but she chose times during the day when she would not interrupt his work or rest. She asked fewer questions and spoke more selectively, seeming to understand that Jack's life on the ranch required focus and balance. Jack appreciated her effort, and their interactions became calmer and more comfortable. What had once been a source of stress had evolved into a friendship that was respectful of his time and needs. Jack also reflected on what he had learned about himself. He realized that setting boundaries was not a sign of weakness or rudeness. It was a necessary part of maintaining his health, his work, and his peace of mind. He thought about the weeks of struggle, the nights filled with tension, and the slow realization that patience alone could not solve every problem. Jack had learned that honesty, firmness, and consistency were essential tools in managing both work and relationships. He had gained confidence, not only in his ability to care for the ranch, but also in his ability to care for himself. The restored balance had other benefits too. Jack's relationships with others in the community improved. Friends who visited the ranch noticed that he was more relaxed and energetic. That strand. Conversations were easier, his patience was steadier, and his presence felt lighter. Neighbors remarked on the improvement, noting that Jack seemed happier and more at peace. Even small interactions like helping a neighbor repair a fence or offering advice on livestock care became more enjoyable because he was no longer weighed down by constant stress. Jack also spent more time reflecting on the beauty and value of the ranch itself. The land with its wide open fields, rolling hills, and grazing cattle was more than just a source of work. It was a place of life and learning. He took time to notice the details he had once taken for granted. The way the morning dew settled on the grass, the soft lowing of cows returning to their pens, and the golden glow of the sun over the hills. These observations, once easy to miss in the rush of work and stress, became moments of quiet joy that reminded Jack why he had dedicated so much of his life to the ranch. In addition to the physical and emotional relief, Jack felt a sense of accomplishment. Taking drastic action had not been easy. Confronting Linda, setting boundaries and enforcing them required courage and consistency. There had been moments of doubt, times when he worried about hurting her feelings, and days when the change in routine felt awkward. But now, looking back, Jack saw that the effort had been worth it. He had protected his peace, preserved the quality of his work, and maintained his health. He had also taught himself an important lesson about the balance between kindness and self-respect. Jack began to plan for the future with a sense of optimism. He thought about ways to improve the ranch, to make daily tasks more efficient, and to ensure that he could maintain the balance he had worked so hard to achieve. He considered planting new crops, improving the irrigation system, and perhaps even building a small guest area for visitors who respected the rhythms of ranch life. The possibilities excited him because he now had the energy and clarity to pursue them. The nights of tension and pressure were behind him, and he could face each day with renewed focus and enthusiasm. One evening, as Jack sat on the porch sipping coffee, he watched the sun sink slowly behind the hills. The sky was painted in shades of orange, pink, and purple, and a soft breeze carried the scent of the earth and the distant pasture. He felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The ranch was running smoothly, the animals were healthy and well cared for, and his own energy and well-being had returned. He reflected on the lessons he had learned, that patience was valuable, but honesty and firmness were essential, that caring for others did not mean sacrificing oneself, and that taking action, even when difficult, could lead to peace and balance. Jack thought about Linda too. Their relationship had changed. What had once been a source of stress was now a connection that was calmer, more respectful, and more meaningful. He realized that boundaries did not end relationships. Instead, they could improve them by creating understanding and mutual respect. Jack appreciated that he had been able to communicate his needs clearly, and that Linda had made the effort to adjust. Their friendship was healthier because it was based on respect and consideration. In the weeks and months that followed, Jack maintained the routines and boundaries he had established. Even when challenges arose, unexpected storms, sick animals, or repair work, he faced them with calm determination. The peace of the evenings remained intact, providing him with the energy and focus needed for the demanding life of a rancher. He had learned that balance was not a one-time achievement but a continuous effort, requiring vigilance, honesty, and care. Jack's story concluded with a sense of harmony. The ranch continued to thrive under his careful attention. The evenings were quiet and restorative, allowing him to reflect, plan, and enjoy the beauty of his surroundings. He had grown stronger, wiser, and more confident in his ability to protect his time and energy while maintaining kindness and patience. The challenges he had faced had taught him valuable lessons about human relationships, self-respect, and the importance of action when necessary. Looking back, Jack realized that the experience had shaped him in a way he could not have imagined. The weeks of pressure, tension, and fatigue had tested his patience, his strength, and his resolve. But they had also taught him the importance of boundaries, the value of self-care, and the power of clear communication. He knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but he felt ready to face them with confidence and grace. Jack's evenings on the ranch had returned to their rightful place, a time of quiet reflection, rest, and peace. He watched the sun set over the fields, listened to the gentle sounds of nature, and felt the satisfaction of a day well spent. The lessons he had learned, the boundaries he had set, and the actions he had taken had restored balance to his life. He had reclaimed his peace, protected his work, and preserved the sanctuary that was the ranch.